Airliners that have disappeared without a trace, unexplained anomalies shrouded in mystery. Today, we're taking a look at the top 15 biggest aviation mysteries that are still unsolved. Number 15. Air France Flight 447. On the 1st of June 2009, Air France Flight 447 took off from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil on a journey to Paris, France. But just a few hours into the flight, it vanished off the radar. It had been above the Atlantic Ocean at the time, and as soon as air traffic control realized they had lost communication with the Airbus A330, they asked other jets in the area to try to make contact. When this failed too, authorities were forced to face the conclusion that something awful had happened to the flight, and the Brazilian Navy was dispatched to try to find any debris, and more importantly, rescue any survivors. There had been 216 passengers and 12 crew on board from 33 different nationalities, all of whom perished in the incident. It would be 5 days after the flight went missing before the first large piece of wreckage and the first 2 bodies were recovered, but it would be a further 2 years before the flight recorders were found and retrieved from the seabed. According to the data that was recorded on the devices, the plane had stalled and was unable to recover before it impacted into the water. But quite why this happened is still not fully known. According to the French investigation, there was an inconsistency between the plane's true speed and the airspeed measurements, something that caused the autopilot to disconnect, and then the flight crew made a series of errors that led to its demise. There are still questions around the record of events, however, with many believing that there must have been further mechanical issues to lead to the stall. Officially, the investigation into what caused the deadliest disaster in Air France history is over, but for many of the families involved, there are still many questions to answer. Number 14. Indian Air Force AN-32. On July 22, 2016, an Indian Air Force Antonov AN-32 took off from Tamboran Air Force Station in Chennai with 29 people aboard who were traveling to Port Blair, which is the capital city of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. Just under 45 minutes after leaving the airport, when the plane was around 170 miles to the east of Chennai, radar contact and radio communication with the plane was lost without any warning. There had been no emergency calls from the flight crew, and weather was nothing out of the ordinary, but the plane vanished without a trace. The Indian Navy was sent to the last recorded position to try to find survivors or wreckage, and the subsequent operation became the country's largest search and rescue operation conducted on water that had ever been carried out. They scoured the area with 12 ships, 5 aircraft, and a submarine, but they couldn't find anything. The jet had 2 emergency locator beacons on board which weren't transmitting, but it didn't have an underwater locator beacon, which would suggest it ended up in the water. Still, to this day, not even a small piece of debris from the flight has been found, so while the 29 passengers are all presumed dead, there are still no definitive answers. Number 13. Aer Lingus Flight 712. If you've ever taken a flight with Aer Lingus between Cork, Ireland and London Heathrow Airport, you may well have flown on Flight 712. This in itself is unusual because airlines tend to have a tradition of discontinuing the flight numbers when an accident happens. But there was nothing unusual about what happened to Flight 712 on the 24th of March in 1968. The Vickers Viscount 803 left Cork Airport on time at 10:32 in the morning, and the weather forecast had predicted calm skies. Within 20 minutes, though, a call came across the radio to air traffic control that's thought to have said 12,000 feet descending, spinning rapidly, and that's the last anyone heard. A flight traveling in the opposite direction was asked to look out for the plane, but when the pilot couldn't see anything, a full alert was declared. The first search aircraft on scene were unable to find any trace of Flight 712, and it was only the following day when ships reached the area that the first bodies were recovered. Even though most of the wreckage was retrieved from the water as well, it's still a complete mystery what caused such a fatal event to occur. There were, of course, a number of theories that were put forward, such as it happened because of a bird strike, was the result of poor maintenance, or it was hit by a missile due to its proximity to a missile testing facility. But each one of these theories have faults that don't line up with the evidence. It happened so long ago that we'll probably never find out the truth, and it'll remain a mystery forever. Number 12. Flight 19. There are lots of rumors about mysterious places in the world where aircraft disappear, with the most famous being the Bermuda Triangle. Many of the stories that are told can be explained without resorting to mystical reasons, but there's a reason why the region in the North Atlantic has become so renowned, and a case from 1945 illustrates it perfectly. Flight 19 was a designation that had been given to a group of 5 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers that were conducting an overwater navigation training flight from Fort Lauderdale in Florida. The aircraft were reliable, and the 14 crew members across the 5 planes were experienced airmen. and despite seeming to have gone off route a little, they had things under control. That was until the 5 planes just vanished, and the last radio message that was heard said, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall." When they realized that emergency was taking place, other aircraft and ships were alerted to launch a rescue mission. A PBM Mariner flying boat was one of the planes that were sent to look with 13 crew on board, and it too vanished. Ships in the area reported seeing a huge fire erupting from the water's surface, which could quite well have been the flying boat. But what happened to the original 5 Grumman Avengers still isn't known to this day. Number 11. Egypt Air Flight 990. Egypt Air Flight 990 used to be a route that was flown by the carrier between Los Angeles International Airport to Cairo via New York. But on Halloween in 1999, something went terribly wrong with the Boeing 767 that was covering it that day. With 203 passengers and 14 crew on board, the flight crashed into the Atlantic Ocean around 62 miles to the south of Nantucket, and there were no survivors. 767s are reliable aircraft, so it's very unusual for something to go wrong as much as this. So a large investigation was ordered to ensure that it would never happen again. Problem was, there was very little information that helped investigators determine a definitive cause, and even now the reason for the crash remains unknown. It's thought possible that there was a mechanical malfunction, that the first officer's controls weren't working properly, or something more sinister took place. The last voice recording from the cockpit was released and appeared to say, "I've made my decision now. I put my faith in God's hands." Could this mean that one of the flight crew ditched the plane on purpose, or was it a malfunction like the investigators initially thought? Number 10. Pan Am Flight 7. Pan Am was the first company to regularly schedule round-the-world flights that stopped at multiple cities over a space of several days before returning to the airport where they had begun. It gave people the chance to take in stopovers across most continents and was heralded as the height of what air travel could offer. That was until the fated Pan Am Flight 7, which departed San Francisco on the first leg of the flight to Honolulu in Hawaii on the 8th of November 1957. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, which was called Clipper Romance of the Skies, took off without any problems, and for the first part of the flight, everything went to plan. Something went catastrophically wrong, however, because the flight crew stopped communicating over the radio. There hadn't been any emergency messages, so for a while it was hoped that it was just a signal fault. But 9 hours after their last transmission, when their fuel would have run out, there still hadn't been any sign of the plane, so a rescue effort was launched. It became the largest search and rescue mission to have ever been conducted in the Pacific Ocean at the time, and it took a week before the wreckage and the bodies of 19 of the 44 passengers were found, around 900 miles to the northeast of Honolulu. There were a number of investigations to try to explain what had happened, but there was such a lack of evidence that no conclusions could be reached. There were suggestions that it could have been sabotage, poor maintenance, or a fire, but these were mere speculation, and the true cause will probably never be known. Number 9. The 1956 B-47 disappearance. While most instances where planes have disappeared are tragic because of the loss of life, there's one aviation mystery that has a potential for far wider destruction and could still pose a risk to this day. On March 10, 1956, a U.S. military Boeing B-47 Stratojet took off from MacDill Air Force Base in Florida with 3 crewmen aboard. Its destination was the Ben Guerir Air Base in Morocco, which was further than the plane's maximum range, so required 2 aerial refuelings. The first went without any problem, but the second was scheduled to take place over the Mediterranean Sea. The tanker plane made visual contact with the B-47, but they flew beneath cloud cover, so the B-47 began to descend through it to refuel. Bizarrely, the plane never emerged beneath the cloud cover and was never seen again. The reason why this was such an important event is because the B-47 had been carrying 2 capsules that contained material for a nuclear weapon, and while there was no risk that it would detonate, it could certainly be used to make a deadly weapon if it fell into the wrong hands. Still, no trace has ever been found of what happened to the plane or crew, and it's hoped that in the best-case scenario, the wreckage, along with the nuclear material, is lying at the bottom of the sea. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. BSAA Stardust. The friends and family of people involved in aviation mysteries often have to come to terms with the fact that they'll never find out what happened to their loved ones. The case of the BSAA Stardust should give them hope, though, because it was a mystery that remained unsolved for more than 50 years. But despite the record now having been found, there are still plenty of questions about what happened. On August 2, 1947, a British South American Airways flight took off from Buenos Aires in Argentina and was scheduled to arrive in Santiago, Chile a few hours later. The plane, known as Stardust, was an Avro 691 Lancastrian and had 11 people on board, including the crew. But as it was crossing the Argentine Andes, it crashed into Mount Tupungado. The last message received from the plane before it disappeared was in Morse code, and it spelled out the letters STENDEC twice. And to this day, nobody knows what that was intended to mean. A large-scale recovery operation was sent along the flight path to recover the plane and any survivors, but they couldn't find any trace of it. It was only in 1998, when 2 climbers were scaling the mountain, that the wreckage was finally found. And even then, it wasn't exactly clear how the plane had crashed. It seems as if the propeller was rotating at cruising speed at the time of impact, so it's possible they thought they had cleared the mountain range and descended into the peak and hit a snowdrift. But this wouldn't explain the mysterious messages that were sent. Exactly what happened, we'll probably never know for sure, but at least the bodies of those on board were finally recovered. Number 7. TWA Flight 800. On July 17, 1996, Trans World Airlines Flight 800 exploded in midair just 12 minutes after taking off from JFK Airport in New York, with the loss of all 230 people on board. It was the 3rd deadliest aircraft accident in U.S. history and led to one of the most comprehensive air crash investigations to ever be undertaken. But despite this, the true cause has never been established. Incidents like this, once a plane has reached cruising altitude, are incredibly rare, so suspicions soon arose that it was an act of terrorism or sabotage. This meant that the FBI and Joint Terrorism Task Force were involved in the investigation at every step, along with the NTSB. Although 16 months after the incident, they announced that there was no sign of foul play. Instead, the leading theory is that a short circuit ignited fuel vapors from the central fuel tank, something that led to new rules about how they need to be insulated on planes that carry passengers. But this is just still a theory and hasn't been conclusively proven. Other suggestions are that the plane was structurally weakened somehow, so it broke apart during a storm. And there are still suspicions something untoward happened, with traces of explosives being found on 3 pieces of debris. Number 6. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. On March 16, 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 departed from Travis Air Force Base in California to Saigon in Vietnam, but it would never make it to its intended destination. The Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation prop liner had been chartered by the U.S. military to transport 93 soldiers and 3 locals to Vietnam, but the last anyone saw of them was when it stopped to refuel in Guam. The pilot sent a message to check in 80 minutes after departure, but when the radio operator in Guam tried to get in touch an hour later, there was no response. A few hours later, after the plane's fuel load would have run out, a large-scale search and rescue mission was launched, which saw aircraft and ships covering 2,000 square miles of ocean over the next 7 days. Despite this effort, no trace of the plane has ever been found, and the only clue as to what happened was a report by a tanker whose crew saw an explosion in the air. It's therefore thought that for some reason the plane suffered from an in-flight explosion, but with no wreckage to analyze, the mystery of what happened to Flight 739 continues. Number 5. Varig Flight 967. It's rare for a pilot to be involved in a plane crash, and almost unheard of for someone to be at the controls of 2 fatal incidents. But that's what happened with Varig Flight 967. It was a cargo plane that took off from Narita International Airport in Japan en route to the International Airport at Los Angeles, but at some point, it vanished above the Pacific Ocean. The pilot, Captain Gilberto Arroyo da Silva, was familiar with the Boeing 707, and he had more than 23,000 logged flying hours, and had been in charge of one that had crashed 6 years earlier in Paris, France. But around 30 minutes after takeoff, the air traffic control lost communication with the jet, and it soon disappeared from radar. Normally, you'd assume something terrible had happened, and search teams were sent out to try to find the wreckage. They found absolutely no trace of the plane whatsoever. And that's when the conspiracy theories began. The flight was carrying a precious cargo, 53 paintings by Japanese-Brazilian artist Manabu Mabe that were valued at the time at around $1.2 million. Could it be possible that the 6 flight crew came up with a plan to take the paintings for themselves? Or was there an awful malfunction that destroyed all evidence of the plane, its cargo, and its crew? Number 4. D.B. Cooper. The story of D.B. Cooper is one of the biggest aviation mysteries of all time, and even to this day, almost 50 years after it took place, pieces of evidence are still coming forward that may one day explain what happened. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was preparing for takeoff from Portland to Seattle. Shortly after reaching altitude, a passenger who was sitting in the rear handed a note to one of the flight attendants. It claimed that the man who gave her the note had a bomb on him, and that he demanded $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck to refuel the plane in Seattle. The pilot called into air traffic control, and to try to keep all the other passengers safe, the president of the airline authorized the payment for the ransom. When the plane landed, the passengers were released, and the man, known only as D.B. Cooper, informed the flight crew of their new destination, in Mexico. The plane was refueled and took off again with just 5 people on board, and 5 other planes followed it to keep track of it. Everyone apart from Cooper was in the flight deck, and this was where things get weird. A couple of warning lights showed that there had been a rapid change of pressure in the cabin, which would suggest that a door had been opened, but it soon resolved itself. When the plane landed in Mexico, it was searched and there was no sign of the man, meaning he must have jumped. But none of the following planes saw any sign of when or where this happened. With that, the man was gone, and despite listing the serial numbers of the ransom and conducting extensive searches, authorities have been unable to find clues about who D.B. Cooper was or where he went. Since then, 3 packets of cash, an old parachute strap, and a handwritten note with Cooper's demands have been found at sites along the plane's flight path. But that's it. In 2016, the FBI officially suspended their investigation into the case, but they did announce that they had collected DNA they believed to be from him. So it's quite possible that one day, after finding further evidence, the case could be reopened. Number 3. Helios Airways Flight 552. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 was preparing for departure from Lamarca Airport in Cyprus, just like any other day. But this would be the last time this particular plane would taxi down to the runway, because it would never make it to its intended destination in Athens, Greece, in what would become the worst aviation disaster in Greek history. The last contact with any of the crew on board was 20 minutes into the flight, but it would be almost another 3 hours until the crash actually happened. This was enough time for fighter jets to be scrambled and locate the plane in the air, and the pilots reported seeing the co-pilot slumped over his controls, with a deployed oxygen mask hanging above him. This would suggest that the plane lost pressurization for some reason, and it was so sudden that no one on board had a chance to attach their masks before they fell unconscious. There was nothing anyone could do, and the plane simply burned all of its fuel before crashing into the ground and killing everyone on board. The question remains, though, what could have caused it? There were suggestions it was to do with a faulty door that had only recently been fixed by engineers, or a structural weakness in the plane's fuselage, but the wreckage was so badly burned in the post-crash fire that the actual cause was impossible to determine. All the black box recorders showed was the heroic attempts by one of the flight attendants to awaken the pilots, but his attempts ultimately proved to be in vain. Number 2. Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was one of the most well-known celebrities of her time, having spearheaded advances in aviation and leading to the formation of the 99s, which was an organization dedicated to assisting female pilots. She set numerous world records, such as being the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic by plane and completing the first transatlantic flight by a female. But she was far from done. Her next challenge was to circumnavigate the world by plane, and it was during this attempt that she and her navigator disappeared. They were flying a Lockheed Electra 10E and were on a leg between Lae Airfield in Papua New Guinea and Howland Island, where they would take a break before continuing on to Hawaii. This was the longest leg of their planned route and took the plane to its absolute limits. They almost made it too, but something happened while they were approaching Howland Island, and they disappeared forever, in what is one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time. There has been speculation that they crashed into the ocean, that they actually landed on another island where they lived out the rest of their lives, or that they were even captured by the Japanese and kept as prisoners. We may never know exactly what happened to Earhart, but her story is probably responsible for inspiring countless people to take to the skies even to this day. Number 1. Malaysian Airlines MH370. Flight disasters are thankfully extremely rare, so when they do happen, it's usually not long before the wreckage is found so investigators can determine what happened to prevent it from occurring again. But there's one mystery from recent times that continues to baffle people the world over: Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370. It took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport on a journey to Beijing in China, but after last communicating with the ground around 38 minutes into the flight, while they were over the South China Sea, the plane vanished from radar and was never seen again. Despite searching more than 46,000 square miles of ocean over the following years, the answer to this mystery seems further away than ever. Several pieces of wreckage have been found washed up on shore as far away as Madagascar, and because it's such a high-profile event, there are countless theories to explain what happened to the plane and the 239 people on board. Was it shut down? Was it hijacked? And could it have possibly landed somewhere else entirely? Or was there a malfunction, perhaps with the autopilot, that steered it in an unpredictable direction, which it continued along until the fuel ran out? With search attempts currently on hiatus until investigators can further narrow down the possible locations of the wreckage, it seems like it'll be a long time before this mystery is finally solved. Chances are that one day the remains of MH370 will be found, though, and it's hoped that it'll only be a matter of years before this happens, so the families of those on board get some degree of closure. Watch our Obscure playlist for more top 15 videos about the more obscure subjects in our world. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best and most obscure videos.